Hey, welcome everyone into the NGK Tech Garage. Today, just as the title suggests, we're talking spark plug installation. Now, there's a lot of common calls that we get on the tech line regarding spark plug installation. Gap, dielectric grease, anti-seize, torquing, intake gaskets, we talk about all these things on the tech line. So my goal today was to create a video that goes over all of those tips and tricks and show you guys some best practices that come with replacing spark plugs. So today in the shop is a 2008 Mercury Mariner. This is a 3-liter V6, just like the Ford Escape, same vehicle with the 3-liter V6. But this will be more generic. I mean, we're going to talk best practices regarding any spark plug installation, especially if you have to remove the intake manifold to get there. So let's start at the beginning of a spark plug install. You got to figure out when your spark plugs need to be changed out. Now, a lot of times you can find this in your owner's manual, but let's say that you've lost your owner's manual or you're looking maybe for a digital effort. So if you go out to our website, ngksparkplugs.com, and you click on the quick part finder, that'll take you here, and you click on cars and trucks, we are going to have a spark plug maintenance interval listed for our vehicles. Now, it's not quite up yet, but it's coming very, very soon. I just wanted to show you guys what is available when it comes to this. So if we go all products, we will on here show you when the OE manufacturer, so when Mercury, recommended that you replace your spark plugs on this vehicle. Now, let's talk about choosing, well, actually, really quick, let's get into service info. And I have this pulled up in service info, and I'll just show you that this thing is due for spark plugs at, I believe it was 90,000 miles on this one. Okay, there we go. So at 90K, this vehicle was due for spark plugs. It's sitting at about 104 right now, so it's a little bit overdue. But either way, we're putting plugs in here, we're getting it tuned up and ready to go. So when we go to the store to buy spark plugs, you can no longer, the way that spark plugs were bought before is as long as it threaded into the hole, you were probably okay. Your heat range had to be within spec and everything like that. But you could, let's say, you could pick a cheaper style spark plug, but that's not really the case anymore. Now, it's always okay to upgrade to a higher level spark plug, but it's not really okay to go backwards anymore, especially on newer turbo GDI, VVT style vehicles. They require a lot more out of the spark plug, okay? The spark plug that you take out might be a $10 to $15 to $20 spark plug that was in that hole. You don't want to go putting in the $3 copper nickel spark plug into that hole because you could end up losing cylinder efficiency, losing power, losing fuel economy, that kind of thing. But it is always okay to upgrade. So actually, we have this is our newest line, the Ruthenium HX line that we just came out with. That's what we're going to be putting in today. This is a double precious metal, so ruthenium on the center electrode, platinum on the ground electrode, and it's a dual fine electrode spark plug, meaning the center electrode is a fine electrode and the ground electrode has a fine electrode. So it's a little bit of an upgrade over the standard double platinum plugs that are in this vehicle. So we'll have a little bit better, hopefully a little bit better fuel economy and power coming out of this engine by just swapping out these plugs. So we get our plugs. It's always a good idea when you're doing a spark plug change with ignition coils. These are coil-on plugs. They all have individual replaceable boots on this one, so it's a good idea to buy the boots and replace those as well. Now, if the customer's decided that they don't want to buy the boots, well, that's a conversation between you and them, but it's always in best practice to replace the spark plug boots as well anytime you're changing out the spark plugs. So, I guess let's just talk quickly about the tools that you'll need. You'll need typically a 5/8 socket is going to be the hex size. Now, some other spark plugs are using different hex sizes, but this one uses a 5/8 hex socket. You'll need a couple other sockets, assorted wrenches and pliers, a ratchet, or power tools. Now, nobody wants to sit through a video of me taking off every bolt by hand, so we got some power tools here. A torque wrench. It's always a good idea to torque your spark plugs because, especially with newer design spark plugs, we're getting down to 10 millimeter diameter spark plugs. They are torqued between 7 and 9 foot-pounds, okay? So be very, very careful if you're dealing with what seems like a tiny spark plug. That's almost like intake manifold torque, okay? That 89 foot-pounds on an intake manifold, that's very similar to 7 to 9 foot-pounds on that 10 millimeter plug. These are 14 millimeter diameter plugs, so we have a little bit more wiggle room on there, but it's always, always, always a good idea to torque your plugs. You're gonna need a gapping tool. Any fine wire spark plug, make sure you're using a wire style gapper like this. Don't use anything that's gonna put pressure on that center electrode. It will snap off if you place any leverage or pressure on there. We got a blowgun here. I use masking tape to cover up the intake ports when I remove the upper intake manifold, and a can of brake cleaner here. So that's the basic tools. You can do this all with hand tools, but for ease of the job here, we're gonna use power tools. So let's get right into it. We have our 3-liter V6 here. 3 cylinders right here, the Easy 3 on the front bank, and then 3 cylinders on the back that are buried underneath our intake manifold. So I'm going to do the easy cylinders first because, well, why not? So grab an air hose, and it's always a good idea to just go ahead and spray off any dirt and dust on there. All right. All right. So unbolt the 3 coils and plug all 3 of them. And now I prefer to keep my coils in the same order, keep them on the same cylinder that they were before. Just something that I've always done. It's up to you, I guess. But what we're looking for here is any sort of carbon tracking. There's a little bit of rust inside of this coil, so it's probably pretty hard to see. But if you can see inside of there, there's a little bit of brown tinge in there. There's a little rust inside of this coil boot. So it is a good idea always to replace the boots, and we have brand new boots here today, so we're good to go with that. This one's real easy. You just peel it off, pull the spring out, and we'll install the new one in there in just a second. So I'm pulling all 3 coils out right now, and what I'm looking for is any sort of oil on this boot. If there's oil on the coil boot right here, that usually means the valve cover gasket seals have failed. There's basically 3 seals between the valve cover itself and the tubes that the spark plugs are down inside of. If the coil boot is covered in oil, or you have oil down in the well in there, then you have a failure of that gasket, and you'll need to purchase and replace that gasket right away as well. So I'm going to set this one here so I remember what cylinder it came out of, and this one here. So nice and dry boots, no leakage in there. We'll take the blowgun again and blow out the holes. All right. Now, never use power tools when you're installing the spark plugs. When we're removing, as long as we're not putting them back in, I'm fine with using power tools, but never on the installation. All right, so all 3 plugs on the front cylinder are out. I'm just going to take a rag and throw it over the holes so nothing can fall in there while we're examining these guys. So these look to be original. They still have the paint mark on the terminal nut here, which is a common thing to show that they're original plugs. If we go ahead and measure the gap, so it looks to be about 60 thousandths for our gap. Now if we go back out to our website and we look over on the right side here, you'll see our gap on these spark plugs is supposed to be 54 thousandths, okay? And you'll find that in the owner's manual. Sometimes you can find it on the sticker under the hood, but this one does not show it on the sticker. Some vehicles used to have it on there. Otherwise, you can always check your service information. If we just go spark plug, and let's get some specs maybe. There we go. So again, 52 to 56 thousandths is our gap spec on this one. So when we're checking the gap on our spark plug, as the spark plug wears, it's going to increase the distance between the center electrode and the ground electrode. So we're going to take this style, again, this style gapper, not one that's going to go between here and put pressure. But if I take, I got the 60 thousandth one right now, I can slide it between there. There should be a little resistance on this thing as it goes between there, and there's not on this one. So our gap is larger than 60 thousandth, okay? So these things are worn. These plugs are worn. They have, you know, we're assuming they have about 104,000 on them. Check the other one, definitely worn and worn, and I can bounce this one up and down inside of there. So we're over a 60 thousandth gap, and our spec again is 52 to 56. So let's go ahead and grab our new plugs here. And again, this is the Ruthenium HX, and you'll notice there's a difference between our original one, which was just the center electrode on there is very wide and there's nothing special about the ground, compared to our center electrode on the new one is very fine, and there's also a fine protruding electrode on the ground side as well. If you can see that, I'll give you guys some close-up shots here. But this is to help increase the ignitability inside of the cylinder. So this is an upgrade for this vehicle, and we should see some changes. So we'll get 3 of these opened up for these 3 front cylinders, and we'll check our gap on these and set it appropriately. So again, we're 52 to 56, so I'll grab a 50 thousandth, and it's a little bit tight. So again, what we're doing is just going between our electrodes here, trying to fit this in there, and it's a little bit too snug. So we're going to take this piece here, and we're just going to bend our ground electrode out slightly. Perfect. And same thing here, it's a little tight. There we go. So you want a little bit of drag on that when you bring it through there, but you don't want it to hang up, and you don't want it to be loose either. So we'll extend out this gap a little bit, and then we should be ready to install these 3. Oh, a little bit more on this one. And again, I'm not putting any pressure, and in fact, if we look over on this camera, I'm not putting any pressure on that center electrode. I'm only on the ground electrode and not touching the tip of that one at all. All right, perfect. A little bit of drag, but nothing else. So now the plugs are gapped. The holes are empty. Everything's dry. Now you'll see there's no anti-seize on this plug. Now our plugs have this trivalent coating, so they don't need any anti-seize. They're not going to bond into the head like other plugs will. So no anti-seize on here and no power tools on this installation. Now some people use a piece of rubber hose that goes around the ceramic at the top here for installing plugs. That's great. It's a good way to make sure you don't cross-thread a spark plug. I'll put it in my spark plug socket with my extension and thread it in by hand. Just what I've always done with them. And we're just going to thread it in until it stops, and then we'll get the torque wrench out and get these things torqued down. So they're threading in nice. If they stop really early, chances are you have them cross-threaded. Be very careful. Take it back out and fix it. Now I don't think these are close enough to get the torque wrench out yet. I don't feel like using the torque wrench that long, so I'm just going to snug them down with a ratchet and then get the torque wrench out. All right, that's snug. Snug. And snug. All right. And let's take a look at what our torque spec is on this one. And these are set for 11 foot-pounds. Now we are using an extension with our torque wrench, and an extension can steal away some of our torque. So I'm going to go ahead and set the torque wrench for 12 foot-pounds, and go ahead and hit each of these. There's 1, 2, and 3. All right, all 3 plugs are torqued. Now, torque is critical on a spark plug because, well, first of all, you can break it if you over torque it. If you under torque it, the spark plug can rattle in there. It can cause you to leak compression out past the threads, and it can cause the spark plug to break. That rattling and that vibration can cause that ceramic to break, and then you have a spark plug that's failed. Also, if you over torque a plug, and it's, let's say that you over torque it, but you didn't break it, it's possible that you've, just like a torque to yield bolt, you've stretched the threads, and that ruins the sealing inside of the spark plug. So now you have a spark plug that's not sealed properly, and again, you can leak out compression and eventually cause the spark plug to fail. So torque is critical, especially as we get into these smaller 12 millimeter and 10 millimeter spark plugs on today's newer engines. All right, let's go ahead and grab our coil boots here. So we got our coil boot and a new spring. So we'll go ahead and pull the old spring out. Put the new one in, just push it in place. Slide the new boot over. Now this one actually does have an arrow, so we're going to line the arrow up with the protruding part on the coil boot here, just like so. You can see the arrow on there, and we have a protrusion on the boot. And then what I'm also going to do is put some dielectric grease in here. Grab it from the toolbox, and we're just going to put a little bit of dielectric grease in the end of the boot, and this is going to help prevent any contamination, any water or moisture from getting in there. So just like so, just a little squeeze in there, and down into the cylinder it goes. So these are the easy 3. Usually you get these done in just a couple of minutes. Goes faster if you're not having to explain everything along the way. But the next ones we'll have to pull the intake manifold off to get there. Again, just a little bit of dielectric grease down in there, down into the hole. All right, perfect. All 3 coils are snug. We'll go ahead and hand start the bolts here and get them plugged back in, and then these 3 are done. Now, if this was a 3-cylinder engine, we'd be done with the job. Great. All right. Now, you could also put a squirt of dielectric grease into the connectors. It's not a bad idea, just to help protect them from the elements as well. They do have a weather pack seal, so you shouldn't have any moisture getting in there, but it's not going to hurt anything just to put a small amount in there. Again, we're not filling the connector by any means. We're just a real small amount. All right, those 3 are done. Simple, right? Now we get to pull the intake off. So torque, no anti-seize, a little bit of dielectric grease. Replace the boots if you can. It's always a good idea, because if we have a failure, or if there's internal flashover of the spark plug where it's flashing over between the terminal nut and the ground, or the nut of the spark plug here, we could end up with having some flash over there. And we talked about this in a previous video. It ruins the coil boot as well. So even it's just always in your best interest, always in best practice to replace the coil boot, just like you used to replace spark plug wires on a car like that. So Just best practice, keeps you from having comebacks. So now we got to get to the other 3 underneath there. So it's time to pull off our intake manifold. So we have our air box here going to the mass airflow, air flowing through here into our intake. We had a bunch of hoses, an EGR valve, some throttle cables underneath here. It's all got to come off to remove our intake manifold out of the way so we can get to those back 3. So I'm going to go ahead and just rip right into this and play this in a faster speed for you guys. Try not to pinch these cables. Don't lay them so tight that you pinch them, okay? These pliers can be super helpful for doing hoses. You can pinch on the hose but not worry about breaking the plastic underneath. Gives you the ability to twist. Because a lot of times these brake booster hoses don't like to come off very nice. Now unfortunately, underneath the throttle body here are 2 coolant hoses going into this intake manifold. Now, if I can avoid it, I'm going to try not to disconnect those coolant hoses that are going into the throttle body. I'm going to try to take the intake, unbolt it, and flip it up, which will give us the ability to clean everything off like it's supposed to be without interrupting or opening up our cooling system. Just will aid in how fast this job goes. And try not to bend the EGR tube too much because you can crack it, okay? Be very, very careful that you don't crack your EGR tube, otherwise you're going to not be very happy. Somebody connected here yet? Oh, okay. All right, so what we're doing, we're just flipping the intake up and over. That way we don't have to open up the cooling system. So it's one less thing we have to do. You know, we don't have to bleed the cooling system back off afterwards, which is one less step. So I'm just taking a little bit of brake clean on a rag right now, and we're going to wipe down this lower intake manifold, get any oil and grime residue off of there. Remember, we did blow off the intake manifold in the beginning there with the air hose when I was doing the spark plug holes. Go ahead and wipe these all down. And then, like I said, I like to use tape on these because it doesn't allow anything to go in there. And if the tape is damaged and there's a hole in it, well, then it's pretty obvious that there could be something in the hole. You know, worst case scenario, you drop a nut or a bolt down here and it gets stuck in the valve, start this thing up and you have a nasty rattle sound that could end up being a mechanical engine failure. So this is just Body Shop masking tape. It's kind of like painter's tape, so it doesn't leave any residue behind, and it sticks really, really well to this plastic or to aluminum or metal, steel intake manifold, whatever it is. It just sticks really well on just about all the surfaces that we have. You can pick this up at like just about any parts store over by all the different paints. So I know a lot of people tend to use a rag. They'll just cover this up with a rag and call it good. Now what I don't like about a rag is that a rag has crevices and has places where bolts can hide. So you pull the rag off later and there could be a nut or a bolt or a socket or something. The 10 millimeter socket's probably hiding somewhere in the creases of the rag, and you pull it off and it falls down into the cylinder. So I like the tape because I know if this is punctured at all in here, that I'm looking for something inside of that hole before I go starting this thing up. If everything is beautiful like this when we're all said and done after the back 3, then we're good to go. Put the intake back on and bolt it back down, torque it down, and call it a day. Just something that I like to do. Just like so. All right, now that we're safe around here, let's go ahead and grab that blowgun, clean off our back 3. And just like before, we're looking for any oil on here, and this one is perfectly dry. All right. Hopefully we have enough clearance to get this in here so I don't have to do this by hand. All right, all 3 plugs are out. I did want to mention one more thing here. This one's a little oily, but there's no oil on the boot. What we're looking for when we pull a plug out is kind of a golden brown color on that white, what should have been white porcelain inside here, white ceramic when it came brand new. We're looking for that golden brown color. This tells us the cylinder is firing the way it's supposed to be. The heat range is accurate, it's firing well. It's not black and oily or sooty. It's not covered in particles like the thing's burning oil or anything like that. So the spark plug kind of offers a look into the cylinder, something that you don't normally get to see, to tell you how your engine's running. So if you take all 6 plugs side by side, they should look all the same, and they should be roughly the same wear. So that gap expansion or erosion should be roughly the same between all 6 cylinders. Now, if you have a plug that comes out perfectly clean and shiny, that could be saying that you might have a head gasket issue that's causing coolant to leak in there. It could come out green and fuzzy depending on the leak. Oil burning could come out kind of fuzzy. If it's running really rich, it'll come out black and sooty. If it's running, if the ceramic on there is bone white, that would mean that the thing's running lean. So it just offers you a little bit of insight into what's happening in the cylinder. So all 6 plugs are out. I'm not going to bother checking the gap on the other 3. At this point, it doesn't matter. We know they're original. Yeah, it's time for a change. So we'll go ahead and set our gap on here. And it's always a good idea to, at the very least, check your gap on new plugs, if not set it right away. So again, we're shooting for that 50 some thousandths where it just hangs up. It doesn't flop in between there, but it doesn't, you don't have to force it either. Yeah, 52 to 50, I think it was 52 to 56 thousandths on here. And again, I'm not putting not putting any pressure on either of those fine electrodes, because they will snap off, okay? And then you're out, you're out a brand new spark plug at that point. And again, we're going 50. A little bit more. Beautiful. All right, so we got 6 new plugs, or three gapped plugs going into the back of this thing. And again, no anti-seize on these. The trivalent plating on there does not allow the spark plugs to bind. So you want to put them in dry like this. Anytime you add anything to the threads, if you put oil on them or anti-seize or even copper anti-seize or grease or anything like that, it changes the friction coefficient between the cylinder head and the spark plug threads. And when we change that friction coefficient, it can allow our spark plugs to be over-torqued without actually trying to over-torque them. So you could have a torque wrench out, and it is possible that you could be over-torquing that plug without even trying, because you've changed that coefficient of friction between the head surface and the plug thread surface. All right, all 3 are snug. Now we'll get the torque wrench out. And again, we're going, spec on here is 11 foot-pounds. I bumped it up 1 foot-pound because of the extension I'm using. All right. Perfect. And we'll need that torque wrench again once we get down to bolting the intake back down. Ooh, this one doesn't want to come out. Oh, and of course there is an instruction sheet in here to tell you how to put the coil boot on, or just pull the old one off, yank the old spring out, push the new spring in, put the new boot on, and line it up. Again, we have a notch here. Line it up with the arrow on the coil, and just a little dab of dielectric in the end. Plug it back in and bolt it down. Simple. So now, unfortunately, this guy right here, EGR valve gasket, I forgot to pick up when I was at the parts store. So I will bolt it back together so we can get it running, show you guys that it runs good after this, but I will have to replace this gasket. I'll have to run to the store and grab a new one. Click, click. Click, click. Click, click. Now, obviously, these coil hold-down bolts, they're not as critical for torque. I mean, we just need to hold the coils down without breaking anything, but without letting them come loose and vibrating loose. So just hand tight on those 1/4-inch ratchet type of thing. You don't need to reef on them. So there we go. Now let's grab a pick. Actually, let's grab a garbage can, throw some of this away. Clean up our workbench a little bit. Now we take a pick and we'll grab these guys out of here. It's always, always, always a good idea to replace your intake gaskets. This is where you end up with those mysterious lean codes after you've replaced your spark plugs. The intake gaskets were compressed at the original torque, and when you take them apart and then redo them, you could end up with lean codes afterwards. So for the couple bucks that the gasket set costs, it's worth always worth doing. Also, when you have your intake manifold off like this, it's always a good time to go ahead and clean up the throttle body on there as well. All right, so I think this gasket set included it's got two different gaskets in there. This is for the upper plenum. This would be for the lower intake manifold to the cylinder head, which we're not doing today. So we got a couple extra gaskets that we can save for the next job, or save for whatever. Or if you want, you can pull the lower intake and replace those gaskets as well. But there's no trouble codes or no issues with this thing, so if it ain't broke, don't fix it, I guess. But I will hang on to these for this customer, and if it would at some point need lower intake gaskets, well, I got them here. All right, so we got new gaskets installed. Everything's clean and dry, and now we're ready to put this thing back down and torque it down. So our tape is still intact. I'm just going to blow the dust and dirt off of there so it doesn't fall down into the cylinders. And I think we're good to go. I always like to double check. All three coils are plugged in, bolted down tight. Everybody's happy. Pull our tape off. And I like to be a little over the top, but I usually take a clean rag at this point. A little bit of brake clean. Just wipe it down one more time to promote that good seal between the gasket and the intake. It might be a little overkill, but it takes 2 seconds to do versus having to pull that intake manifold again. And I mean, it was still dirty, so still pulled some more dirt off of there. So, all right, let's get this guy laid back in place. Like so. Now, I don't know if you guys caught that when I flipped that intake over, but our weather pack seal actually came out of our idle air control valve connector. So we got to make sure that guy goes back in where it belongs, which goes in this connector right here. So you don't want to accidentally sandwich that in there and ruin the seal. Otherwise, you can end up with water intrusion inside of there. And speaking of that, I probably should have put some dielectric grease in those connectors back there. Let's yank this off really quick. Just a little dab will do ya. And actually, you could do this on every connector on an engine except for your oxygen sensor connectors. All right. Get everybody in place and happy here. Oh, got a throttle cable stuck. So you want to make sure it's laying flat before you go starting any of the bolts. Otherwise, you could have something pinched underneath there, and you could, upon tightening the bolts, you could actually break the plastic intake manifold. Okay, so be very, very careful that you haven't pinched a wire harness or a throttle cable or whatever it might be underneath there. So I like to just hand start each bolt, make sure that we're threading in before throwing any other tools on there, and I'm just going a couple threads in so I can feel the threads lining up. Now, a lot of intake manifolds have a torque sequence. We covered this in a previous video where you're supposed to go a certain pattern. So we'll go ahead and pull that up on here and see what our torque spec and sequence is. So we're doing our upper intake. Remove all that stuff. There's some bolts. And there's our sequence. So 89 inch-pounds, pretty common for a plastic intake manifold. And there's our sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So a pretty common torque sequence. It's one that kind of tends to get memorized when you're in the shop. So now that I just do a quick look on here, make sure there's nothing in the way, we'll go ahead and start getting these tightened down. So because I don't want to take my torque wrench and run, I mean, these are pretty long bolts. I'm not going to take my torque wrench and use it that whole time. So I'm just taking this guy and I'm just running them snug, but I'm going to do it in order. And we should start by going on instead of off. we'll go 1, and we're just going until they make contact. 2. Now you usually find that the first 1 or 2 or 3 are usually loose after you've done this because you've pulled the whole manifold down into place. So yep, it wasn't tight. Oh, that one got a little too tight. All right, let's hit them with the torque wrench, 89 inch-pounds. So again, I'm using an extension, so I'm going to go just a little bit higher. So I'm going to bring it down to 9 foot-pounds, switch it over to inch-pounds. That brings me to 108. Let's go with an even 100. One, 2. I think 3 was up, right? Yep, 3. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we'll just double check one more time. 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you're ever wondering about specs or this sequence or anything like that, you don't have access to service information, we do offer a tech line. If you just go out to the ngk.com, there is go contact us. We do have technical support, prompt 2 at that 1877 number. So give us a call, and we'd be happy to email you out a spec sheet or whatever you may need if you need it. If you're doing this and you don't have access to service information like we do, like this right here, this service information that I'm using is it's a paid subscription that we purchase every month. And most shops have some form of service info. So let's go ahead and kind of work through getting everything reconnected on here. Now, I don't know, I don't really have any order as I'm going back through reconnecting everything. I just kind of try to do everything, I don't know, in however my brain decides to do it at that moment. It's usually not any sort of order. As long as it all gets connected in the end, back to the way it should be, we're good to go. Ooh. All right, reattach our breather system. And if you're not familiar with these clips are common on Fords. They have a little tab on the back. You push that tab outwards and down, and that'll release it. And then when you put it back together, you don't have to do anything. You just bring it till it clicks home, and you're good to go. EGR valve. And again, I'll have to replace this gasket. Any gasket you take apart should be replaced, unless it says something different in service information. But you always want to follow that, obviously. But if in this case, I will replace this gasket after I get to the parts store. It's really just a 2-minute thing. Click, click. All right. Now we got a harness that's kind of wonky here. It's wrapped around the wrong side. Reconnect our purge solenoid hoses. We should have a connector. There we go. All right, up here we have throttle position. And see this right here? This guy right here is just to help the harness stay in place. So if you don't reconnect these, don't put these back, or if you break them and you don't somehow secure that harness, you can end up with wires chafing or rubbing through somewhere. And that's where you get those intermittent problems when you shift from drive to reverse, or you go over railroad tracks, or whatever it may be. So you want to avoid those. You always want to put the harnesses back in their stays where they belong. Somewhere here we're missing our idle air control valve connector. Oh, hiding around the back. And again, this is the one that we had to put the weather pack seal back in. All right, we gotta. Okay, brake booster hose is back on. That's good to go. We gotta put our cables back on yet. Now, of course, I did drop one of these little bolts here and it just, of course, because this is being recorded, had to fall down into the drain underneath. So I'll have to grab that after this video's all done and run that bolt in there. But we'll do our best to line up the hole perfectly. That one's down in the drain. So I get to go fishing after I move the vehicle here, but it won't affect it for just backing the vehicle up out of the way. And we'll open up the throttle blade, get our cable back in there. Drive-by-wire systems will just have a connector. You won't have this cable anymore on a drive-by-wire. Hook up our cruise control cable. It's got a click. You want to make sure it doesn't come back off. And let's double check everything before I take the air intake snorkel and put it back on. Coolant hoses are still in good shape. We didn't touch those. EGR, purge, throttle position's okay. That guy's tight. Everything is tight. I think we're good. Bolts are torqued down. Let's grab this guy. Get this wonderful airbox assembly back together. Like so. Oh, I didn't mention this red locking tab when I was taking this apart. A lot of connectors will have these locking tabs on them now. You got to pull them out, and then you can release the connector. And then when you're done, you want to make sure the connector's tight and just clip it back in. That keeps the connector from being able to be accidentally loosened. There we go. All right. So everything is connected. I'm going to leave that cover off of this at the moment just because I have to fish that bolt out, but otherwise we would just have this cover to put back on and then we're good to go. So that's not going to keep me from starting this guy up though. So let's go ahead and fire it up, and it does have an exhaust leak. We're going to fix later, but nice and smooth feeling. And just checking no flashing check engine light or anything like that. We're good to go. This has the old exhaust manifold stud broken on the front manifold on here, so it's something for another day. So I guess that's about it. That's a pretty standard spark plug change. I guess just key takeaways on here. If you're buying spark plugs, it's better to go with a higher quality spark plug. You know, taking a platinum out and putting an iridium in or a ruthenium in. Rather than going backwards. You don't want to go backwards with spark plugs because you're going to lower your cylinder's efficiency, okay? This ruthenium plug is a nice upgrade for this engine. It's out now. It's something that we just came out with. So fantastic plug, and No anti-seize on there. A little bit of dielectric grease in the coil boot or spark plug wire, either way. Yeah, so I think that's it. So hopefully you guys picked up a couple tips when installing spark plugs on this one, and or doing a manifold. Hopefully this gives you some confidence in doing your own spark plugs. If you want to tackle the job yourself, torque wrench is key here. But you know, a lot of parts stores rent torque wrenches. So if you don't have one at home, maybe see if the parts store's got one that you can rent or borrow one from somebody. So oh, and the gapper, if you're using the coin style gapper feeler gauges, don't use them on fine wire spark plugs because you can break that tip off. Grab yourself one of these wire style like this. Other than that, I think that's going to do it. So thank you for watching. Really appreciate you being there. If you enjoyed this video, if this video gave you something, or just you enjoyed listening to me ramble on about replacing spark plugs or whatever it is, give us a thumbs up. Really appreciate it. Hit the subscribe button. Hit that little bell icon in there. That way you get notified anytime we come out with some sort of new technical video, whether it's replacing spark plugs or whatever it might be. So once again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you again next time in the NGK Tech Garage. Thank you.